Intercept has been doing an excellent deep dive into reporting at the New York Times and how it specifically covers Gaza and Israel. In its latest salvo, the Intercept revealed a newly leaked memo from the Times, which it says told the staff to avoid words such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, and occupied territory when reporting on Israel's war in Gaza. The Intercept reported that the memo also tells reporters to steer clear of the word Palestine, quote, except in very rare cases. This new reporting comes from the Intercept's D.C. bureau chief, Ryan Grimm, and editor-at-large, Jeremy Scahill.
Scahill has published a great deal of reporting on the Israel-Hamas war, as well as the New York Times coverage of October 7th, including the outlet's claims alleging that sexual violence took place on that day. He joins us now to discuss the recently leaked New York Times memo. Thanks for joining our show.
Great to be with you guys again.
Great to have you. Yeah, this is a really fascinating report you put together here on the sort of editorial guidance, the language suggested by top editors, standards editors at the New York Times, that seems to me to really want to avoid any descriptive language, putting its thumbs on the scale of one side of this conflict. What do you say?
Well, what we're hearing from staffers from within the New York Times newsroom is that this memo, on the surface, it might look like, the standard style memos and style guides that are common among news organizations, particularly in the United States. But that if you actually understand the history of the Israel war against the people of Palestine, then you start to understand that it basically is an argument to embrace Israel's narrative at all expense. And what they point to in the memo is, for instance, the use of the word genocide. It's not just that they don't want their reporters saying Israel is engaged in genocidal action. There are very few news outlets in the United States that are going to permit that. But they even restrict the use of the word genocide by people that they're interviewing. And the same goes for ethnic cleansing, to push back and ask for specifics. And they say that genocide has a very specific legal definition. So it's also in the case of people that they're interviewing. But perhaps most stunning to people who followed Israel-Palestine is that they also try to encourage their reporters not to use the term occupied territories, despite the fact that the United Nations and international law is very clear that these are occupied territories, and to not even use the word Palestine unless it's in the context of discussions at the United Nations about Palestinian statehood. And one of the other things that the guidance, this style memo, says is that, incendiary or emotive language, like massacre or carnage or atrocity, that they should try to shy away from those. But the Intercept has done analyses on the use of those very terms by the New York Times and other news outlets, and shown quite clearly that the New York Times has no problem using those words when describing violence committed by Palestinians, but almost never when describing violence committed by Israelis, even when they are deliberately attacking civilians or civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's what really raised my eyebrows the most when I read your story was, which you point out, the guidance against having people they're interviewing using this language additionally. I can understand why, wanting to keep the actual news reporting as free of description as possible can maybe be a laudable goal, but then if you have a human rights scholar or an Israel spokesperson or whoever it is, and they're going to characterize it using stronger language, that seems like pretty standard practice. And here they are specifically saying to avoid that.
Right. And Robbie, as you and Bree both know, because you cover this and you've been reporting on it yourselves, the New York Times has widely been ridiculed for the sorts of headlines that they deploy when Palestinians are killed. And you often have to wonder, well, who fired that, that missile from a drone that killed the Palestinians, or who was it that, shot and executed all of these people? Because oftentimes the perpetrator of the crimes committed against the Palestinians is entirely omitted, certainly from the headlines. But in the case of this memo, it also comes as part of a broader context where there's been an uprising of sorts within the New York Times newsroom of journalists who feel that the paper is exhibiting extraordinary bias in favor of Israel. And in fact, when the New York Times launched their internal leak investigation to try to determine who was speaking to the Intercept, our understanding is that they explicitly targeted Middle Eastern and North African employees and employees or staffers who were part of discussion groups and associations based on their ethnicity or their regional affiliations. The New York Times denies that, but it seems pretty clear from the staffers that we've been talking to and statements that have been put out by the New York Times Guild that they have engaged in racial or ethnic or national orientation targeting of people on suspicion that these are the individuals that are leaking to the Intercept. And at the heart of this story is not just the broader Gaza coverage, but also specifically the marquee story called Screams Without Words, which the top byline on that was the Pulitzer Prize-winning Bigfoot reporter Jeffrey Gettleman, but it also included an Israeli filmmaker with no real journalistic background named Anat Schwartz, and then another very, very young former food blogger named Adam Sella. This is one of the most incendiary pieces of journalism that has been produced since October 7th and is viewed as the gold standard by people who propagate Israel's narrative that Hamas went into Gaza with a premeditated plan to commit rape and sexual violence in a systematic manner. And that piece has just been completely dismantled by independent media outlets and others. You know, the Intercept has reported on it, so has Electronic Intifada, Gray Zone, Hondo Weiss. The journalist Layla Al-Aryan had written to the New York Times days after that piece came out, pointing out inconsistencies. And the most recent thing that happened is we did a story saying that one of the incidents in the Screams Without Words story that the New York Times published involved an allegation that two teenage girls had been raped and murdered by Hamas, and it was based on one source, a Israeli Special Forces paramedic, who said that he discovered the bodies of the girls at Kibbutz Be'eri, and one of them had semen smeared on her back. We interviewed the spokesperson for that kibbutz, who said, this is false. Family members of those girls, including their grandparents, have said, it's a horrible thing to have to say, but they were just murdered. They weren't sexually assaulted. We went back to the New York Times and asked them about that. They said, we stand by the reporting. And then a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times itself is shown video in Israel that was filmed by an Israeli soldier who was the one who discovered those girls. And it totally gives lie to the narrative that was promoted in the New York Times that these girls were sexually assaulted. It was one of only a handful of specific cases that the Times had reported on. And instead of issuing a correction, even after the New York Times reported on the existence of this video and that their Jerusalem bureau chief had seen the video, they refused to issue a proper correction. They did what we call in journalism a quiet internal update to their story. And in fact, last Friday, that story was part of a package that received the George Polk Award, a prestigious journalism award. Interestingly, according to our sources, the poster that was created in honor of that did not include any representation of Screams Without Words. And Jeffrey Gettleman, the most famous reporter on it, was not at the awards ceremony.
Jeremy, I don't want to skip past really the volume of words that are implicated by this memo, around which there is a very specific advice that really does go quite a far way to shaping the character of the stories that are getting reported on. You mentioned the discussion around the word genocide and the failure to talk about ethnic cleansing. Can you speak to the advice around the word terrorism that you write about in your piece, and also maybe get a little bit more into the broader geopolitical implications of asking people to avoid the word Palestine or Palestinian in headlines and in stories both?
Right. So according to the guidance that was first issued in the middle of November and then has been updated periodically since then, they're saying that Palestine, I'll start with that one, that Palestine should not be used in the body of the text of the piece or in headlines, and that it should only be used when strictly discussing, and they give an example, deliberations at the United Nations involving Palestinian statehood. This is a total erasure of the fact that there historically was a Palestine, that there are Palestinians, that this is Palestinian land, and that Palestine should be an independent nation, and that it's because the United States and Israel and a handful of other countries are blocking it, that is not universally accepted. But this really indicates a total deference to Israel's narrative. The refugee camps issue is also another one, Bree, that I think is really bears scrutiny. The United Nations has long, for decades, since the Nakba in 1948, established UNRWA, a UN agency that has purview over these displaced Palestinians who were forcibly expelled from their homes. And there are multiple internationally recognized refugee camps inside of Gaza where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians live awaiting their right of return. For the New York Times to say we should not refer to these as refugee camps, but to sort of describe them as crowded neighborhoods and, if necessary, refer to that history of why they had been referred to or labeled refugee camps, that can be acceptable in some cases. This is an attempt to whitewash the fact that Israel has systematically bombed and attacked refugee camps within Gaza itself. This is really indicative of the kind of reporting that we've been seeing from the New York Times and where it comes from. I don't think anyone who follows this was like shocked or, clutching their pearls at what they had seen. I think a lot of people understood that this was the basic gist of the New York Times policy. But to see it spelled out in this manner, I think is very important. And I really am appreciative of the voices from within the New York Times newsroom who are actually blowing the whistle about matters of extraordinary public interest.
I think that's an important point because I do think that sometimes in our media criticism, we can be overly broad in talking about the broad political directions or biases of one institution or another. But for whistleblowers, not just in the case of your reporting on this piece, but what we found out about internal discord around the Screams Without Words article, what happened when they tried to do the podcast version of it, and basically the podcast fact checkers were unable to substantiate the story, is a significant part of why we know there was so much internal discord at the New York Times. Have you seen any additional mainstream criticism of this or backlash to these stories as they've been reported, or has there been a kind of a circling of the wagons among the mainstream press?
No, there's been very little criticism from other newspapers. I mean, the Wall Street Journal has been reporting in recent days on the kerfuffle in the New York Times newsroom and has done a couple of stories this week. But let's not pretend that this is just an issue with the New York Times. This is also an issue with other major newspapers and media outlets. And in fact, just to give one example, Bree, the New York Times, which is very conservative in crediting other news outlets when they break stories or they report something first, was very fast to point out that CNN and the Associated Press and other major U.S. news organizations had also used the testimony of this alleged Israeli paramedic to say that these sexual assaults had occurred at Kibbutz Be'eri. The New York Times put that very high up in their piece that these other news outlets had also reported on that story based on that source. So I think part of it is that all of them do this. We just happen to be seeing the New York Times style memo. I would imagine these exist in many newsrooms. I should say there's a lot of great reporters at the New York Times. There's a lot of really incredible reporting that is taking place. There are photographers that have been working in Gaza for the New York Times who've done absolutely heroic work. This is not to paint all of the journalists with a broad brush. Clearly, there are journalists of conscience there. It's that on an institutional level, it is very clear that the New York Times has an agenda of deferring to the Israeli and American narratives almost always.
Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both.